Welcome to the Self-Storage Insight Podcast. I'm Ben Shirey, and today I'm joined by Nate Kinet with SafeLease. And Nate, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. Super excited to talk about tenant protection plans with you.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me on, Ben. Looking forward to it.
Awesome. So if you don't mind, give our audience a little bit of your background with SafeLease and maybe your background in protection plans and self-storage.
Sure. I have been in the storage industry and with SafeLease for about 3.5 years, really since the company's inception. SafeLease, for those that don't know, we are a technology-enabled tenant insurance and tenant protection provider, exclusively focused on the self-storage industry. Currently, our products are distributed in over 2,000 facilities across the country. And that represents about 500,000 total units across those facilities. So we've grown really, really quickly. And like I mentioned, really laser focused on tenant insurance and tenant protection at this time.
Awesome. And so if you don't mind, give us a little bit of just the definition, I guess, between what is the difference? You know, we always hear the difference between tenant insurance. You always kind of emphasize between tenant insurance and tenant protection. If you can just give us a brief explanation of what the difference is there.
Sure. I will give the Cliff Notes version because this can be a pretty lengthy topic. But tenant insurance and tenant protection are the two most common products that are sold to tenants to protect the items that they're storing in their units. And so typically protection plans and insurance policies cover theft and damage to those items. The differences between the two products really are on the back end with how risk gets transferred from the tenant to an insuring entity. And so to keep it really brief, with tenant insurance, the risk goes directly from the tenant to the insurance carrier in exchange for monthly premiums. The insurance carrier is saying, I'll cover you up to some dollar amount. Tenant protection is a little bit different. You're not, if you're a tenant buying an insurance policy, you're essentially or effectively paying an additional amount of rent every month to the owner. The owner of the facility or the landlord is saying, tenant, I'll cover you up to a certain dollar amount for theft and damage. And then what the owner is doing on the back end is they're essentially insuring that risk with what is called a contractual liability policy, or a CLIP, if you've heard that term thrown around. And so again, like the very short Cliff Notes version, for tenants, they operate pretty much the same way. The difference is how the risk gets transferred, with the owner being a pass-through of the risk for protection plans.
Okay, awesome. And so in your experience, what are you kind of seeing in terms of like the businesses that are adding this? What advantages do they gain over facilities that aren't offering tenant protection plans to their tenants?
Yeah, good question. I think there's a couple benefits, but the big one, I think, that's the most obvious, is it becomes a very valuable revenue stream for facilities. I think a well-implemented, maintained protection plan or insurance program can generate up to 10% of a store's or account for up to 10% of a store's NOI. And so, that becomes super meaningful. Typically, a facility keeps either what is called an administrative fee or some portion of the revenue that the program generates. And so I think that's number one. Number two, I think owners and operators like to kind of wash their hands of having sort of any liability when it comes to their tenants' belongings. And so what we see or what we hear is, when someone's unit gets broken into, or someone's stuff gets damaged because of water or rodents or whatever, the first thing they do is typically go to the landlord and say, hey, landlord, what are you going to do to make this situation better? And so if you have a protection plan program or an insurance program in place, then all of a sudden the tenant goes to the insurance carrier and files a claim to get made whole versus having to go and nag the owner, the operator, to make the situation better. And so I think those are probably the two most common benefits, but the number one is going to be the revenue stream that typically accompanies these programs.
Okay. And from an owner or manager's perspective, so when their tenant goes to file a claim, are they pretty involved in that process? Is that kind of something that you guys handle with the tenant directly? How involved does a business need to be in these claims?
Yeah, good question. I think it really depends on the partner that you work with. We hear all different types of kind of claim setups. I've heard some where stores are super involved, where store managers have to fill out forms and provide documentation to substantiate claims. In our case, we deal with tenants directly. There are very few instances where we go to a store manager or ask the store to provide us anything. In most cases, we can adjudicate or work a claim, completely independently of any involvement from the store. So really depends. I think probably the ideal scenario for tenants as well as, operators is going to be the tenant just comes to your protection plan or insurance provider and they work the claim directly with the tenant.
Okay. So they can kind of be hands off if they want to, which is nice.
Yeah, I think a common thing that we hear all the time is people say to us, they're like, we run storage facilities. We are not in the insurance business. And so
Right.
to the extent that they can avoid having to be involved in claims, I think that's certainly, the preferred route.
For sure. And so for a facility that hasn't had tenant insurance, or maybe they did have tenant insurance and they're switching to a different provider, what does that implementation look like? Is it a pretty extensive process to implement tenant insurance for your facility?
I don't know that I would use the word extensive. I think, typically these programs get rolled out pretty easily. This is not like a technical solution. If anything, I think it's more of an operational problem, right? Like you have to send notices to your tenants. You have to tell them that you're implementing a program. You obviously have to build it into your move-in process when tenants come in the door. And so, there's some kind of tenant implications, but, programs can be rolled out relatively quickly. If you're going the tenant insurance route, there's some extra kind of regulatory licensing stuff that needs to be done up front. But even that is not a ton of work. And so, we're talking like a matter of weeks or days, not months, to get a program stood up.
Right. And would you typically see a company that rolls out a tenant insurance plan versus tenant protection plans? Are they larger facilities, or is there not a specific
It's a
difference
good
between?
question. It really depends. As I think about like the REITs, right? You think about CubeSmart and Public and all the really big companies, Extra Space. I think, they've done both insurance and protection plans from what I know. We work with some really big groups that have, 30, 40, 50 stores that prefer insurance. And we work with some really big groups that prefer protection plans. And so, I think at the end of the day, it's really what risk transfer kind of protocol folks are comfortable with. And I think that's kind of why it kind of gets at the heart of why we offer both products. Right? We think both products are good products. We understand that there's some storage operators that prefer insurance versus protection plans and vice versa. And so, our philosophy is let's offer both products. It's really about implementing and the tools around implementing either that really make or break the success of someone's program, less about the actual product itself.
Okay. And with these kind of plans, so just something that I heard recently from a couple of different storage facilities that we work with was that, again, this wouldn't be their tenant protection plans, but their actual insurance for their business, that their premiums were skyrocketing. In some cases, I've heard they were doubling, tripling, or even more. Is that something that also is like passing through the tenant protection plans, or are they going up at a significant rate, or have they been pretty steady through this?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, on the kind of implications for insurance and protection plan, no, we haven't seen, similar price increases. In fact, in the past 3.5 years since we started our business, we haven't had a kind of a mandatory price increase across the board at all. And so,
Okay.
to answer that question, no. Um, but I will echo what you said to start the question. I think property insurance is probably the number one most talked about thing as I go to these different trade shows. It's hurting every storage business. Everyone's getting slammed with high premiums. And so it certainly seems to be, an area of opportunity for, improvement on the operations side. So, yeah,
Yeah.
I think something definitely to keep an eye on.
Yeah. Yeah. The one guy I was just talking to yesterday, his premiums went from 6,500 to 19,000. And
Crazy.
so yeah, I mean, that's a pretty big price increase. So yeah, I don't, in terms of what you guys cover with the protection plans, we're in the midst of a hurricane right now that's hitting the South Coast. And maybe this is a question we can cut out if you don't want to talk about it. Does anything get covered in those instances? Is that kind of, it's off the board in terms of offering coverage for that sort of event?
No, I think it's a great question. So as I think about coverages, right, the way that I always explain it is like in its simplest form, there's two kind of buckets, right? There's theft and there's damage. Theft is obviously someone cuts the lock, goes into the unit, steals all the stuff, right? Classic burglary. We cover thefts. I think it's actually our number one most covered type of claim.
Okay.
Then you think about damage, right? Damage can be a million different things. It could be fires, it could be rodents, it could be a leaky roof, it could be water, mold, that type of stuff. Um, there is a little variation of what's covered between insurance and protection plans. When you think about things like a hurricane or tornadoes, and so it also kind of depends on the route you go with the model. But there are certainly instances where natural disasters are covered.
Okay. And so then that'd definitely be a benefit that you could mention to your tenants in some areas for sure in terms of what their supplemental coverage covers. Because again, I don't know. I mean, I was just watching even 60 Minutes on Sunday did a big thing on insurance adjustments and all of these losses that they're just the adjusters are changing how much they're paying out to people in these instances of hurricanes and stuff. So there was actually a big segment on TV about it just this weekend. I was watching a little bit, and so if you're in the midst of something like that, getting your homeowner's policy or whatever to cover your self-storage damage, you might be up the creek for a while before you'd see any type of compensation from something like that.
Yeah, but even beyond just the big weather events, I mean, owners need to think about kind of worst case scenarios for a variety of things, right? Like this year, we've dealt with a bunch of fires at facilities across the country, and those aren't geographic specific, right? Those aren't weather related necessarily, but those are the types of things that happen at storage facilities, that have a huge impact and impacts a variety or a high number of tenants at one time. And so,
Right.
again, I think that just speaks to why you would want to implement something like this.
For sure. And so whenever you guys work with a new facility that's going to be adding this to their tenants, what are some of the things that you do to kind of help them get tenants enrolled in these protection plans, or do you assist the facility in that?
Yeah, look, I think at the end of the day, like our goal is to help facilities enroll as many tenants as possible. And so, in order to do that, we need to, one, make it easy, right? Again, we hear all the time self storage store managers are not in the insurance business. They don't want to be in the insurance business. And so, we need to take that heavy lifting or burden off of them. Two, we need to train store managers how to operate the program. They don't need to become experts in insurance or protection plans. Typically, the way that really successful storage facilities implement these programs is by making it mandatory for tenants to have some kind of insurance in order to rent a unit. And so they make it a requirement. And so really what's happening is the store manager has to implement or enforce that rule, right? They don't have to sell the policy to the tenants. What they have to do is they have to enforce their insurance requirements. And so what they're saying to a tenant is, hey, tenant, in order to rent a unit from me, you either need to show me that you have your own insurance, or you can purchase one of these protection plans or insurance policies that we offer, right? And I think when a store manager realizes that it's more of enforcing a rule versus trying to sell someone on the benefits of an insurance policy, becomes a heck of a lot easier to stomach and actually implement when you're talking to a tenant. And so yes, those are the types of things that we will train store managers on, and teams on when we roll out a program. But again, if you're requiring your tenants to have some form of insurance, the kind of selling of the policies typically, they sell themselves because the tenant has to do something in order to move in to their unit.
Right. Yeah. And I was reading an article recently. I don't remember where it was even from. It was just talking about the backlash that storage facility owners get when damage does occur and their tenants thought that their stuff would be covered, but it wasn't because there was no coverage option in place and their insurance doesn't cover that. So it's, again, the article was just referencing how much backlash you can get from your tenants by not giving them an option. And so I was curious how many times you run into that sort of thing, or how many times that comes up when you're talking to facilities that are adding it. Are they adding it because something happened and they weren't covered?
Well, I think most self-storage leases say that tenants are responsible for their own stored items, the contents that they put inside the units, right? And leases are very specific to say that the ownership has no responsibility or liability when it comes to the tenant's items. I think what happens in kind of the real world, though, even though there's that clause in a lease, when something does go wrong, the tenant still goes to the landlord and says, what's going on here? Or they go to Google and leave a bad review about how horrible the facility is, even though they signed this lease that says the landlord is totally not responsible. And so, again, I think that just speaks to why you'd want to implement something like this, because when if that were to happen, if you had a protection plan program, it's like, hey, you pay this extra $12, now you can go file a claim and be reimbursed for a covered loss. And so, yeah, I think that's something we hear all the time.
Yeah. And you're so right on that. As far as, it doesn't really matter what you put in the lease. When somebody gets upset, they'll voice their opinion on the internet and everybody's going to see it. Right. So, regardless of whether or not your lease states that you're not liable, you're going to get a lot of backlash from somebody who's upset. And I mean, we deal with that kind of stuff too, where it's like, oh, we're clearly not involved in this part of your business, but something doesn't go right and they're going to find somebody to blame. Right. So it's usually going to come back.
And furthermore, like we've heard stories of, people have that in their lease, something happens, tenant complains, they go to Google, they write a 1-star review, and then all of a sudden the owner wants to make it right. So like, all of a sudden they're compensating the tenant so that it doesn't reflect poorly on their reputation. And so again, it's just a lot easier to say, hey, you have this protection plan or insurance policy, go file a claim, kind of alleviates some of the burden or headache on the landlord, but obviously, should make it a better experience for the tenant because, they have peace of mind knowing that they'll be made whole if it's covered loss.
Right. And so when a facility is requiring people to either provide proof of their own insurance versus, signing up for a new plan with you guys, you do like a 3-day window where they can provide that insurance. Do you normally get a lot of people that just say, screw it, I'll just add the plan? Or do you get a high percentage that decide to upload their proof of insurance?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. So on the 3-day, so we call that window a grace period, and it's actually customizable. I think a lot of facilities will say, if you don't submit proof of insurance at move-in, then you have to have a protection plan. And so I think the default is actually 0 days.
Okay.
But again, it's customizable. Some facilities will say, we want a 2-day or a 4-day, 5-day grace period. And so what happens is super interesting. 85% on average of tenants will purchase the store's protection plan or insurance product. Only about 10 or 15% of tenants are going to go and upload an insurance policy. And so I ask people that all the time. I'm like, what percentage of tenants do you think purchase a protection plan? And nearly everyone says, 40%, 30%. But I think it's because it's just a lot easier to check a box saying you're going to pay an extra $12 because you want to go move into your storage unit. You don't want to have to go try to find an insurance policy, upload it, or bring it into the store. It's just a hassle. And so what typically happens is people add on the protection plan and get on with their life.
And do you ever get any pushback at all, or do you ever hear from the facility managers that they get pushback from that being something that's required, or is there any downside to that for the facility?
Yeah, I think we'd be lying if we said there was no pushback, right? Like, of course, there's going to be pushback, but I think it's one of those things where it's like typically it's only a couple tenants. They make it seem like the world is going to end. They'll want their voice to be heard for 24 hours, but then they get on with their life. And so you'll hear from a handful of tenants when you implement a coverage requirement. It's pretty rare that someone would move out. Maybe you'll have a couple move outs, but you should be able to backfill those with tenants who are okay with the insurance requirement. And so, I try to always paint this picture of like keeping things in perspective. If you have 3 or 4 tenants who are being very vocal about it, well, typically there's hundreds that kind of take it on the chin and either add a protection plan or opt out with some sort of proof of insurance coverage.
Right. And typically, if it's a really low percentage of customers too, the income that you're gaining from implementing it is going to completely offset those few customers that you may lose and refill their units in 30 days anyway.
It's exactly right. It's a math problem at the end of the day, right? You could go and do a rent increase, or you could implement a coverage requirement on the insurance side. And the benefit of doing the insurance option is that at least you're giving your tenants something in exchange for additional monthly rent, right? You're giving them an insurance or a protection plan. Whereas if you just did another rent increase, you're just charging more money for the same 10 by 10 concrete box.
Right. Yeah. And the last person I had talked to too that was implementing it said like his customers also like, because they have an option, right? They can upload their own insurance and not receive that increase. And so he really definitely liked adding that to his new facilities as he would purchase them versus doing a rate increase right away. He would implement tenant insurance first and then wait to do the first rate increase till down the road.
Yeah, and I think that's actually an interesting point because I think that's a common misconception when our team anyway goes out and talks about this insurance requirement concept. I think a lot of times people think that means they're required to get a SafeLease plan. That's actually not the case. You can't force someone to buy a specific insurance policy or protection plan. You can say to them, you have to have some form of insurance and give them a choice. And as I just mentioned, typically what that'll do is result in about 80 or 85% of your tenants getting whatever you sell at the store. But again, I think the key is that the tenant does have an option.
Awesome. Yeah. And great information on all that. Is there anything you would say, I guess, to a facility owner as we kind of wrap it up, that's possibly interested in adding tenant protection plans, but he hasn't pulled the trigger yet? Is there any last piece of advice you'd want to share with somebody that's looking to add tenant insurance or tenant protection plans?
That's a good question. I think one of the common things that we hear from folks who are apprehensive is, well, there's a couple things. I think number one, people say, well, no one in my area is requiring insurance. I think more often than not, when we do some competitive research and look at other facilities in most areas, it's definitely becoming more and more common. And so I would say that's number one, like things are continuing to change. And so more and more people are adopting these plans. What else? I think another apprehension we hear is like people are nervous to implement the requirement. Well, there are options when you think about implementing an insurance requirement. You could just start with only your new tenants moving forward, right? And that's a way for you to get comfortable with how adoption is going to go, and tenants taking a protection plan versus providing their own insurance. And then maybe 6 months later or a year later, you can implement that coverage requirement to your existing tenants. And so I think, a piece of advice would be like, you don't have to jump into the deep end right away if you want to get comfortable with how these programs operate. And so there are certainly different options out there to enable you to get more comfortable.
Sure. So they do have a little bit of flexibility as they roll it out to where they can.
Yeah, I think it's,
Step into it a little slower.
the way that I describe it always is like this is kind of like a toolkit that we provide operators, right? It's their business, it's their customers. We can't tell you how to run your business. We can obviously give you best practices and say, here's where we see facilities being successful. And so at the end of the day, it's like, how do you take that toolkit and implement it within your existing storage operations?
Awesome. So best way to get a hold of you if somebody wants to reach out or connect with you if they have questions or talk to somebody on your team?
Yeah, good question. SafeLease.com is our website. We've got a contact us form on there. I think we get back to folks very, very quickly if they reach out wanting to chat or have questions for us.
Yeah, I know everybody that we've sent over, you guys have been very responsive in communicating with them. And so, yeah, pretty quick to respond, which is always a plus when you're working with any company. Any storage, I always like to ask this at the end of the podcast, any story, any horror story from self-storage that you've heard that you'd like to share, or we can kind of just cut it out and skip it if you don't want to.
Good question. I don't know if there's a specific horror story. Every month we have a company-wide all hands, and our head of claims always does a little section at the end of the all hands, and he'll share, some of the crazier claims that get filed in a given month. And we've really seen it all at this point. One that stands out, well, a couple, but one in particular. We work with a facility in Minnesota. They offer outdoor RV parking or trailer parking. And of course, we're talking depths of winter. I think it was February or March, so snow everywhere. And a tenant had filed a claim, but the facility submitted the security camera footage. The guy broke into the facility, broke into the trailer at like 2 a.m. and stole a snowmobile out of the trailer. And he closed up the trailer and drove away in the snowmobile. 2 days later, he did the exact same thing because there was another snowmobile in the trailer. So he went back 2 days later to steal the other snowmobile. And it was only after both had been stolen had they noticed that, the gentleman came back to see that both of his snowmobiles were gone. But that one just stood out because it was like a multi-day theft. In Minnesota, in the middle of the night, freezing temperatures, and so it's funny. We've pretty much seen it all at this point. There are so many interesting claims situations that come our way. So just when you think you've seen it all, something new happens.
For sure. Well, Nate, it's been great talking to you about this, and thank you so much for joining me and kind of sharing some information on what you guys are doing and different protection plan options. And really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, likewise, Ben. We've enjoyed working with you guys and are excited to continue to build on our relationship, and appreciate you having me on today.
Absolutely. Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Self-Storage Insight Podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Just a quick reminder, this episode was brought to you by CC Storage. CC Storage is a no-cost property management software that allows you to pass the fees for credit card processing on to your tenants, freeing up some CapEx space for your business and helping you more efficiently run your storage facility. If you'd like to learn more about CC Storage, click the link in the description below, and we hope to see you again for our next episode.